Thank you. Look, as a visitor to this place, I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'm a Mulunjali woman belonging to the Yugambeh language group, and I was born and raised on Yagara country. I'd like to thank Professor Diwa for the invitation, Emeritus Professor Robert Mann, and the endorsement of Professor Dennis McDermott, with whom I've had the privilege of working with. Look, I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Marie Pardee and the 170 or so academics who authorised the open letter to La Trobe objecting to this forum in its original form, which was originally a debate between Tom and Tim about whether Australia is still racist. Those opposed specifically requested that the debate be reorganised as a forum that considers the extent and modes of racism in Australia today and how these might be addressed, and secondly, that the speaker list include a minimum of Indigenous and Muslim speakers. And while I think the question effectively has remained the same, about 2 weeks ago I did receive an invitation, and here I am. I wish to speak to my decision to participate in this forum, not that I owe anyone an explanation as a blackfella as to why I might have something to say about racism, but I'm conscious that for some my presence here may well be read as some kind of validation of the problematic assumptions that frame this forum this evening, including that which is contained within the question. But don't worry, I will follow the brief and I'll answer the question, but rest assured it won't take me 15 minutes. I'm not here to be part of an equity project as the Indigenous participant, accessorising this event. When Ahmed speaks of being the feminist killjoy, I think of myself as the black speed bump of the capital B kind. A cautionary disruption to an otherwise smooth ride. I also reassure myself and those around me that the real inconvenience in my uncomfortable presence is not experienced by those that ride roughshod over me. It will always be my body that will bear the brunt and carry the weight. So whatever inconvenience or disruption is experienced in this next little while, rest assured that the weight I carry will be far heavier. But I do so with the genuine hope of carving out more productive and critical conversations about race as an oppressive structure to enable strategising around how we might undermine it, as it continues to bear down heavy on the lives of blackfellas in this country every single day. So let's get the question out of the way. The question is fundamentally flawed because it's premised on the idea that racism is an artefact of a bygone era and as something that is external to Australian political life. Australian history has more than a racial dimension. Race has been foundational to this country. It arrived on the ships in 1788 along with the convicts, marines, seamen and civil officers when we first became known as their Aborigines. It was the enabler to their illegal acquisition of our land. Race was the means by which we were named and claimed. In fact, as Goldberg points out, European expansion across the globe was rationalised in racial terms. More than moral judgments, ideas of race were empirical descriptions. Here, race was turned into a foundational code cemented in place by scientists and philosophers, writers and literary critics, public intellectuals and artists, journalists and clergy, politicians and bureaucrats, each of which became the day labourers or bricklayers of racial foundations. In our becoming Aborigines, we have been known by them and through our relationship to them, cementing a relationship of power over us, physically, morally, intellectually, politically and legislatively. We simply cannot talk about racism without talking about race and its origins as foundational to this society. We need to look no further than the Constitution and the race power which claim to regulate the affairs of the people of coloured or inferior races who are in the Commonwealth, which of course excluded us as blackfellas because we were meant to die out. Via race we were and were soon to become non-existent. This race power enabled the new Parliament as one of its first acts to restrict non-white, non-British immigration, which of course was sustained up until the 1950s through to the 1970s. At this same time, Aboriginal peoples in Queensland were subjected to the restriction of the sale of opium and Protection of Aborigines Act, in which all Aboriginal people were made wards of the state from the 1890s through to the 1970s, with almost every aspect of our lives controlled by the state. Relocated off our lands, children removed and labour exploited as a means of protection in our passing. This is my father's generation. And there is not one blackfella in the state of Queensland who can describe their family tree to you without referencing that legislation. Hence this talk of lone wolves and racism suddenly entering the political mainstream are absurd to blackfellas. Thank you. I was fortunate that I was born just a few years after the enactment of the Racial Discrimination Act, and I have successfully tested state legislation in my own community of Inala. But in my lifetime, I've also witnessed the suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act on 3 separate occasions, and each and every time, it was only in relation to Aboriginal people. And strangely enough, it was to do with land every time, not women and children, as they'd have you believe. Just last week, Senator Pat Dodson, in addressing the censure motion against Fraser Anning, powerfully stated, "Our First Nations peoples have carried the consequences of murderous prejudice throughout our entwined history." He goes on to point out, "We know what it's like to be powerless in the face of hateful prejudice, fanned by the illusion of superiority and the false courage created by a weapon in the hand of an oppressor." Senator Dodson was not playing identity politics. He was testifying to the violence of racism upon blackfellas here in this country, and he reminds us of the unique vantage point of Indigenous peoples and our ability to illuminate understandings of race and racism in this country. It is thus interesting to me that my presence here, as someone who is First Nations and first raced, finds myself last placed in a conversation about race right now. This positioning is neither a mistake or a coincidence. Not human, intellectually inferior, childlike, dying and doomed, from missing link to lowest rung. Blackfellas have felt the full brunt of the violence of racism in all of its forms, and we know too well that it's not aberrational, but rather foundational, which has always and only ever been predicated upon our non-existence. The same ideology that refuses to recognise black existence is the same which fails to see black excellence and black intelligence. Right now. I found most revealing the organisers' original claim in the promotion of this event that Tim and Tom were, and I quote, "the 2 most important voices on this debate on racism." I couldn't find evidence of Tom's scholarly work around race and racism except some opinion pieces that appear to diminish or downplay its existence. And I mean, it's fine to have an opinion, but as an academic, a little more is required of me. And as a black fella, a hell of a lot more is required of me to occupy the position of knower, regardless of how articulate and how intelligent I actually am. It was telling here that in the introductions online, I was positioned as a distinguished academic who has worked in Indigenous health promotion, culture, identity and community development, who, like everyone else, is a close observer of Australian political culture, which is true, and it's a line in my bio. But it struck me, if they were going to take a line from my bio, why wouldn't it be the line about my current research, which aims to advance our understandings of race in contemporary Indigenous public health discourse and practice? Surely my scholarly work around race would be more relevant than my work around identity, culture and health promotion. Meanwhile, the other most important voice on the realness of racism is the former Race Discrimination Commissioner, who has publicly claimed that the Northern Territory Emergency Response and later the Stronger Solutions policy in the Northern Territory, although racisty, was okay because it was for a worthwhile cause. And he too brought the line that it was about sexual abuse in Aboriginal communities. And while it's pleasing to hear Tim take a stronger position on matters pertaining to race, having left the post, his final speech as Race Discrimination Commissioner made only 2 mentions of Indigenous peoples, both in our relation to our experiences of racism as being stopped in stores or subjected to searches or being denied services by businesses and taxis. There is a passing reference to institutional racism as a legacy of colonial racism, but he does not unpack or explore how that manifests or what we should do, but instead testifies to growing up in the heartland of multicultural Sydney and extolling the virtue of the Racial Discrimination Act, stating, "It has given Australians of all backgrounds a means of holding racial discrimination to account." But if only that were the case. As a student of history and politics, I'm sure Tom will tell you about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Protection Act of 1984, the Native Title Amendment Act of 1998, and of course we know about the Northern Territory National Emergency Response of 2007, all of which required suspending that Racial Discrimination Act. So I don't know why we're not telling the truth about the Racial Discrimination Act, not actually holding racial discrimination to account, specifically for blackfellas in our land, from South Australia to the Torres Strait to the Northern Territory. In our continued presence, blackfellas are the uncomfortable truth that this nation must reconcile itself with. We are the most courageous when it comes to conversations about race, having copped the full brunt of its violence. But also because we have nothing else left to lose, literally. In my being, I refuse to bear false witness to these lies. Racism deniers and model migrants, regardless of their academic track record, will never advance our collective understanding of race in this country, and nor will debates framed on false binaries about whether racism is real or situating the battleground between the left and the right side of politics. Race has worked for the settlers regardless of which political party is in power. One might feel a little less racisty, but it doesn't mean it is. The ongoing racialised inequalities experienced by Indigenous peoples tells us so, as does the refusal to meaningfully negotiate coexistence across this continent. As blackfellas in coming to these conversations about race, we do more than just testify about our existence and our experience. We've long theorised these bruises upon our bodies and the social, cultural, political and economic conditions of our communities. Foregrounding blackfellas' contributions to critical race scholarship will illuminate in a far more sophisticated way our understanding of race, which intellectually is still centred around the Northern Hemisphere. We need to develop for ourselves an understanding of racism that attends to race as a structure of oppression, rather than as a matter of individual prejudices or attitudes, one that focuses on facts over feelings, and that foregrounds Indigenous sovereignty, rather than diversity, tolerance, inclusion and multiculturalism. It is only through advancing our understanding of race, rather than debating its existence, that we can undermine the very real and ongoing effects of racism, if we genuinely despise it as much as we say we do. If I can conclude by returning to the question that brought us here tonight, has racism in contemporary Australia entered the political mainstream? Let me just say the real question we should be asking is, when will it leave? But the truth is, it will stay as long as the settlers do, for they are the ones most emotionally attached to an ideological commitment to race. And herein lies the opportunity and the obligation of academic institutions in the colony to foster sophisticated and intelligent conversations about how race and racism operate right here and right now, and not leave it to a few good, and perhaps some might say, mediocre men and their opinions. Thank you.
Chelsea.
Thank you.
We now have some time for some question and answer from the audience. Just a few points before we begin. I'm going to take questions one by one. This is recorded, so if you could speak into the microphone when I call for you. If you could introduce yourself and be quite brief with your question, so that I can try and fit in as many questions as we can before we conclude the event. So, anybody like to ask a question?
Both a question and a comment, and I want to first of all thank you, Chelsea, very much, because you reminded us that this is not just happening now, and it's not just happening in the last 20 years. It's been happening from day one. I wonder if you want to comment on the work. I've worked in the community for 45 years or more. Yes, I am a past student of Trobe University, where I did Aboriginal studies back in the late 70s, early 80s. And I was actually laughed at because I was told that if I was going to work with migrants, I was wasting my time doing Aboriginal studies. Is there a difficulty in working together? I worked for the Institute of Multicultural Affairs back in the 80s, and there was a reluctance to work together, Indigenous and migrant, towards a common goal, and racism was, the common enemy. Is that still the situation today? Is that seen as such? In a brief comment, yes, racism never left. It's not, did it enter? It never actually left. It was here day one with 18 nationalities in the first fleet. Never acknowledged. It's here today when we're not teaching children about camellias. None of my 9 grandchildren and 3 children have ever come home from school and said, we learned something about Western Australia, Northern Territory. You know the camellias? Never a mention. Never a mention of the pearlers. Never a mention of the Chinese contribution here early on. Can we work together now?
Look, I think, not to speak on behalf of all the native folk, but I think that, you know, if you look at the more recent events of the Uluru Statement, there is an appeal from Indigenous peoples to negotiate some form of coexistence that came about through consultation, but it was deemed radical. So there's an interesting kind of framing of as Indigenous peoples being difficult to work with, because I think it's a pretty reasonable request to have some sort of negotiated coexistence. I think sometimes as an Indigenous person, at times feel betrayed by the non-white settlers in this place. In an appeal to whiteness, you know, such as the racial hierarchy, it's much easier to not be on the bottom rung. And so sometimes there's a sense of betrayal in terms of not validating the experiences that we have, or even undermining our claims about this country and how it treats Indigenous peoples. And hence the concern with the model migrant. I can never be a model Aborigine. I just can't.
Can I add to that? I mean, I think there is cooperation and there is solidarity on racial equality. Now, some people may disagree, but when we had to argue for the maintenance and for the defence of Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, I can tell you those who were leading were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advocates, but also migrant community leaders. They were the people I was working with and talking to, and they were the ones who were advocating in unison to defend the Racial Discrimination Act from partial repeal. I would point to that as a very clear example in recent history where you have had Aboriginal advocates and multicultural advocates working together and being entirely in lockstep. Now, I think there's a lot about our architecture in our laws that militates against racial equality. You know, I'd be the first to acknowledge the limitations of the Racial Discrimination Act. We don't have a constitutional protection of racial equality, which is precisely why the Parliament can legislate to suspend the Racial Discrimination Act, as it has on a number of occasions. Now, I've always believed that it is unconscionable to suspend the Racial Discrimination Act. I mean, Chelsea mentioned my previous writings on income management. That was written after the reinstatement of the Racial Discrimination Act. But I'd also be the first to acknowledge, as I did in the very first few weeks of my time as Race Discrimination Commissioner, that we also evolve and learn. And some of the views that I would have put on public record before I took on the role weren't particularly the views that I would hold today or would hold when I was in the role. And I've been open about that and have publicly acknowledged that. And I think there's a need to just assess all this with a degree of sober scrutiny, in that I think we all acknowledge colonial history, at least I hope we'd all acknowledge colonial history and the effects that it has, that Australian nationhood has had race and racism as part of its definition. And this is part of the reason why it's so difficult for us to eradicate racism and to achieve racial equality. I would say that that's a view that's shared by a vast majority of people. Doesn't dominate, you know, I mean, I think that's where the mainstream of our society today lies, but the threat we encounter today is that consensus and mainstream is being eroded and chipped away. And this is why it's important to talk about these things.
Tasneem and Tom, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, look, I take the comments on board. I have, in the last couple of years, through different conference opportunities, been panels where we've actually specifically negotiated the issue of Indigenous Australians and multicultural women and why they don't interact, why they don't intersect when they should. There are a lot of shared experiences of dispossession and dislocation, but somehow, for a host of reasons, they've never been at the same table. And I'm probably the first to say that, through the work that I do, I have a lot of Indigenous Australian friends who are activists and academics, but within my community, I had a conversation just recently with a group of women who went to New Zealand in the wake of the Christchurch incident, and they were commenting how overwhelmed they were with the way that the Māori in that country and all New Zealanders seem to, by comparison, have a far more greater connection at grassroots level. And she goes, but here when we come back to Melbourne, when I come back to Australia, I've been here for 25 years, I've never met an Indigenous person, I've never met an Aboriginal person. And I kind of felt culpability of, well, gosh, I should be doing something because I'm interacting within my portfolios of work, but I've never seen to meld the two, but there should be more active done, so yeah. Culpability.
I'd simply say that the claim that this historic stain of colonialism and racism dominates modern Australia is challenged by the fact that we've had mainstream Indigenous policymakers in this country over the last 40 or 50 years who have tried to redress the original sins of colonialism, through land rights, separation, self-determination, welcome to country. Now, good and decent people can disagree with some of those policies, but this has been an attempt by policymakers to make amends. Now, on the Uluru Statement, there is no single body of Aboriginal thought. We're a nation of individuals. All ethnic groups consist of individuals who have different views. So I can think of many prominent conservative Indigenous people, such as Warren Mundine and Jacinta Price, and her mother, Bess Price. They've been long-time speakers at the think tank that I run, who would challenge someone like Chelsea on a lot of these issues. So there's a danger here in only having one voice representing an ethnic group. I think that could make a bad situation worse.
Would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think that it wasn't one voice, the Uluru Statement. There's a whole process of consultation around the country that included Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So I think you're misrepresenting the Uluru Statement by saying one voice. There was an investment in a fairly substantial process there. So that just to be clear on that, yeah. The thing about being framed as an ethnic group, we think of ourselves as First Nations peoples. I'm not looking for racial equality. That might be part of my emancipatory work. What we need to talk about is sovereignty here. And we always look to New Zealand about how wonderful that relationship is. They've got a treaty. Yes. Why are we so uneasy about entering into a process together, collectively, about what rightful coexistence should mean? It really isn't a radical proposition. I think, blackfellas have been fairly accommodating, fairly forgiving, fairly inclusive, and it's about going, well, what does it say about this nation and its steadfast refusal to be the only nation in the Commonwealth that does not have a treaty with its First Nations peoples? This is who we are.
Other questions? Hands high up, if we can. Yes, up the back there with the white coat. Yep.
Hi, my name's Jocasta. I just want to know what anyone thinks the world would look like today if Jacinda Ardern had been the President of the United States after 9/11.
We'd all be moving to America. Maybe. I don't know. I think, obviously she's textbook in the way that she responded with calm, with empathy initially, then with calm, then action. She wasn't following the playbook of other leaders who in the aftermath of attacks go straight for vengeance and hostility. Mind you, that would have probably looked like attacking Australia if that were the case, which could have been very awkward. But I still think the way that she so effortlessly and instinctively empathised with New Zealanders and called them New Zealanders and calling them us and them, in that the language that she used, I think, and semantics matter, language matters so much as a leader, and I think she nailed it. She nailed it from the get-go. By contrast, I recall the interview with Waleed Ali and Scott Morrison, and when he was referring to the Australian Muslims, it was I, and they. By comparison, Jacinda's approach was very encompassing of they are us, we are them from the start. And I think the fact, that the amount of compassion that she demonstrated from the funerals, the aftermath, the actions the government took to cover the burials, etc., and to provide provisions long-term of income support and protecting a family. I mean, the suite of actions was so humane, so empathetic, that she set the bar now high, I think, for all leaders to emulate. And I imagine a lot of Western leaders would be rightfully holding their heads in shame, looking at the way they've responded. So, yeah, that's all I'll say.
Tim, did you want to say anything on that question?
Nothing too much to add to what Tasneem's already said, but I would say Jacinda Ardern's demonstration of empathy and her ability to connect emotionally with people is a hallmark of her leadership, and that's a distinct contrast to other political leaders.
Chelsea?
The New Zealand Prime Minister's conduct has been flawless and she deserves high praise, no question about it. But on the question about America, one can be a critic of Donald Trump, as I am, and still recognise that it's understandable why he got elected. Some left liberal scholars such as Mark Liller, Jonathan Haidt, Francis Fukuyama have argued that he only came about because in those Rust Belt states that usually vote Democrat, there was a sense of dislocation and displacement as a result of globalisation and rapid technological change on the one hand, but also a lot of these white working class folks felt alienated by the Democrat Party's prosecution of what's called identity politics, and they felt more marginalised, and Trump, for all his flaws, resonated with them in a way that no Republican or Democrat has in the recent times. So it's all well and good to mock the United States and Donald Trump, but you've got to put these things in a broader historical context. But on the question of Jacinda Ardern, she did a wonderful job. I was in New Zealand immediately afterwards, and the overwhelming consensus among centre-right national politicians and Labor politicians was that she did a great job.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple more questions. Yes, the gentleman beside here.
Hi, my name's Aidan. First off, I'd like to say I'm really thankful that the university and you have been willing to talk on this conversation, because it's something that I feel we lack very much in our national debate. And that actually links into my question, or it's a bit more of a hypothesis, but it can still be answered yes or no. With how sort of taboo the subject of racism has become, do you believe that the perception of what people are actually saying and the outlawing of certain speech is actually preventing underneath good ideas from actually being discussed and coming to the surface? So, for example, Pauline Hanson's statement, "It's okay to be white." You yourself mentioned it. It is a statement that is mired in white supremacy, but if you strip it of all bias, I'm pretty sure a lot of us can appreciate that me being a white person is of no consequences. Nothing wrong with me being white as a person. It's my ideas that matter. So I'm just curious what you think about that.
Maybe we'll start from this end and work our way across. Chelsea?
Sorry, I thought you were going in a different direction. We were talking about the taboo of race, because as someone who's interested in critical race scholarship, there's certainly a whole lot of anxiety about that kind of intellectual work within this country. I'm not sure there's taboo about saying racist stuff. I think there's a difference. So when Pauline Hanson and any number of politicians support this idea it's okay to be white, it's funny because of course it is. Like, of course it is. You actually don't need to pass a motion. It's like rubbing our faces in it. I know full well how okay it is to be white. I'm the daughter of a white woman and a cosmetically apparent Aboriginal man. I know the difference and how this world treats those bodies. And so the real taboo in this country is around talking about race. That's what the taboo is, even as a category of analysis. We know we preside over some of the largest racialised inequalities in this country, but can we analyse it via race? No, because apparently that's it's not scholarly. And that's why we haven't gotten anywhere, is that we're not engaging with this intellectually. It's all about people's feelings. And actually, that doesn't help me from dying 10 years earlier than you. And that's why, as a black fella, I've come to work in the academy, because I actually want to engage intellectually with race as an oppressive structure to undermine it. I don't want to entertain people's feelings about it anymore.
Can we get you to talk into the microphone, please? Thank you.
That a fear about talking about the underlying issues which can be associated with people of certain races has led to a rise in populist thought and...
Look, I think there's anxiety about being called racist, but there's a comfortability with race as a structure of our society. And I want to focus on the other.
Did you want to say
Very
anything?
quickly, I was just going to say that it's okay to be white, a motion that Hanson put through in the Senate, I think was obviously not just bizarre, but offensive in so many ways, but it was actually mirroring in many respects. Now, I think this gets to your question, what many people who sympathise with her motion, a response to the identity politics of the left, that it's creating different groups based on race, religion and gender. And this will only divide our communities further. I think that's what you're getting at, and I understand that point, but I think there's nothing wrong with universalism. And you know, Martin Luther King put it best in 1963 when he said, "Judge people by the content of their character, not the colour of their skin."
That was an aspirational goal, and I know people use that a lot, but that...
Isn't that a great goal?
He was assassinated. Do we forget that
mean,
part?
The goal
what killed
is
him?
a very
What killed him,
noble
though?
goal.
The reality. What killed him?
Well, what's the alternative to that?
I mean, it's a great aspiration to have, but people quote it as a way to kind of assert this kind of race and colour blindness. It's amazing to me that we could be so indifferent to the reality of how race works.
So what's the alternative to Martin Luther King's ethos?
I think you're cherry picking bits of what he had to say. I'm not.
That's the quote. That's the quote. Judge people by the
He was
content of their
murdered,
character.
but was he judged by the content of his character?
His vision still continues. People
Look,
still live up to
and
that.
that's, I guess what I'm
There's
saying.
a statue-
It's an aspirational goal, but the reality right now is race is working in a particular kind of way, and we have, in order to undermine it or do away with it, if we can transcend race, we have to still talk about race. We have to understand how it's working.
I'd love to get Tasneem or Tim to comment on some of this, if we can.
Yeah, well, I won't touch on the Martin Luther King stuff, but what I will say is that freedom of speech does not preclude freedom from responsibility. So with hate speech and when hateful, vitriolic speech borders on to the aggressive and incites violence, there has to be a limit. There has to be a limit, and that's what legislations are for. And often the people who are most upset and determined to keep the boundaries of speech open and unbridled are those who've got the least to lose. They really want that ability to be racist to be protected, and I think that's what needs to be called out. I recall just really quickly when the 18C Act was being toured around the country for feedback and for hearings, to get people's views about would you want this legislation watered down or not. I recall very, very clearly being in a panel with someone from the Greek Orthodox Church, from the Jewish community and from another society, and we all had to one by one stand up and present ourselves before a panel of all white, predominantly male either MPs or bureaucrats, and I had to stand in front of them and defend or basically negotiate what I was offended by, because they were actually given the power to decide if that was worthy or not. So that premise is inherently problematic, and so that is why it's not okay to be racist. That is why it might be okay to be white, but it's not okay to be racist. And if legislations are there that make people feel uncomfortable because there are boundaries, there's a reason for that.
Tim, would you like to?
Yeah, on it's okay to be white, I mean, the context clearly matters, and there are extremist groups who've gone to considerable lengths to express their ideas in a more sophisticated manner and to express them in as benign a form as possible. So that slogan is an example of that. If you wanted to break it down as well, I mean, there's a difference, I believe, between expressing pride in your race or expressing pride in your heritage or your tradition. Now, I think there's nothing wrong with celebrating your Englishness or your Germanness or your Polishness or your Italianness or whatever. But to say that in racial terms connotes something different, particularly if there's a history around whiteness and white power, and there's a colonial history involved in that. Onto your other part of your question about driving ideas out from underground. I mean, this is a familiar idea that we've heard about why you need to have good forms of speech countering bad forms of speech, that if you're going to see or hear hate speech, for example, then at least it's out in the open, sunlight can disinfect it, and people can see the ugliness for what it is. In theory, sure, I think you can see the appeal of that. But I haven't heard anyone who's been exposed to racist hate speech ever say to me that they were grateful for the experience of having copped racism because it's had the effect of flushing us out from underground so that everyone in the community can see how ugly it was and can see it being condemned. I have yet to meet someone who has actually said that to me. And I would say that in talking about race and racism, we've got to remember this is something that affects people's lives. This is not just an abstract exercise in ideas. It's not a salon discussion. It may be for some, but for others, you've got to live with this and have the burden of copying hate and discrimination. So I believe that the law does play a vitally important role in setting a standard in our society and in making sure that we create the right tone for public debate. So I think, the marketplace of ideas is great in theory, but often we're encountered with market failure.
Okay. I'm afraid that I can see that there's a few hands that have gone up, but I'm afraid that that's all the time that we have for the Q&A today. So I'd like to invite the Vice-Chancellor back to the stage to conclude tonight's proceedings.
Thank you very much, Beck. I think this has been one of the most compelling hour and 40 minutes now that I've been privileged to be party to as part of these Ideas in Society discussions. I think we can all go home tonight with some fresh ideas and perspectives in our minds. I think each one of our speakers has been absolutely terrific this evening. So could you please put your hands together once more in joining Tim Sipomazan, Tasneem Chopra, Tom Switzer and Chelsea Bond, and of course thank you to Beck Strating for chairing the discussion so beautifully, and I'd like again to thank Emeritus Professor Rob Mann who put the whole thing together. That concludes tonight's formalities. I can't resist, though, a quick plug for the next event planned for this series, which will be in June. It's entitled What Kind of Feminism Do We Need and What's Still to Be Achieved? And that will see us hearing from Clementine Ford and Petra Buskins, moderated by another fabulous La Trobe woman, La Trobe's prize-winning historian, Claire Wright. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much indeed.